Right, good afternoon everybody, and thank you very much for coming today. I'm delighted that you can join us for this afternoon's session on diversity in economics. We're joined by Dr. Arun Advani from the University of Warwick. He has many hats, including Commissioner with the Wealth Tax Commission, a Research Fellow with the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and he's also co-chair of Diversity in Economics, a campaign to increase the diversity of people who study and work in economics. And Mairi Spowage, who has just taken over as Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. And before doing that, she was Deputy Director and also a civil servant for many years, including as Deputy Chief Executive of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So I'm honoured that you're both here today. The David Hume Institute, for those of you that haven't joined us before, is an independent think tank based in Edinburgh, and we've been operating at the heart of public policy for the last 35 years. The reason we're interested in talking to both of you today is we've just done a really big research project speaking to 4,500 people, or over 4,500 people in Scotland, about a whole range of issues that are important to them, and whose voices were being heard was a recurring theme throughout the research. And when you think about the economy, people had a lot to say about the economy in all different types of language. But the diversity of thought is critical to how those decisions are being made and whose voices are being heard. So we're really keen to go back to the data. And as Arun's analysed all of this recently, we thought, well, we want to see what everyone thinks of it and get some more discussion going. So that's what we're going to focus on today. For those of you on Twitter, please do tweet using the hashtag DHIBytes, and Lucy put up the handles for Mairi and Arun before the event. And what we'll do is we'll have the two speakers speaking for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, depending on how much we talk, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to post those questions. Lucy will then let you know which order we're taking those in, and we'll unmic you so that you can ask your questions directly to the speakers. So without further ado, over to Arun.
Great, thanks very much, Susan. I hope everyone can see my screen. So what I'll do, kind of kicking off from where Susan left off, I guess, is to first briefly talk a bit about some of the research that economists do. Because I think that was, in a way, one of the many ways into this question for me was looking at the kind of research we're producing. I think I'll show you a couple of quick stats on what we do as economists. And that really speaks to this issue of, who is it that's producing the research? Why is the research we produce what it is? And so I'll spend some time thinking at that. And at the end, I'll talk a bit about how things are changing. Given the time limits, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of the bits, but there'll be lots of time for things to come out in questions. I'm happy to answer because there's quite a lot of other bits of detail that I just won't be able to cover in the time. So, we've seen these sort of, the dimensions of which I'll be talking about diversity for today will mainly be ethnicity. I'll talk a bit about sex as well. There are clearly many other dimensions to diversity, but one of the reasons I think that in the recent year, there's been a big debate around diversity, including in economics, has been the killing of George Floyd in the US and the Black Lives Matter protest that sparked first in the US and then kind of spreading across the Atlantic to here. Discussions about statues, discussions about our reckoning with history, and these kind of questions, they're really kind of fundamental to society, and they're really important to also things that economists do. We have the tools to think about questions like inequality, like discrimination. And so I'll just briefly talk to you about how much we are, or in fact aren't, doing it, and then I'll talk a lot more about how diverse we are, which I think is one of the real key reasons why we don't tackle these questions that much. This is just one of two graphs I'll show you just on this sort of background question. This is work with Elliot Ash, Imran Rasool, and David Kai, and we're looking here at just over the broad sweep of history. We didn't want to show you all the way back to the late 1800s, so showing you for the last 70 years, I can't add up 60 years, what share of research that economists do is somehow related to race. And we do this kind of in an algorithmic way. We can't obviously read the many hundreds of thousands of papers that have been published there individually, and so we kind of have this computer algorithm that we develop. I'm happy to chat about it, but that classifies through all these papers and works out, are they in some sense thinking about issues of race and ethnicity? That's one, very salient dimension of diversity. As I say, it's not the only one that one should think about, but it's a very salient one, and one that until recently hasn't been sort of at the forefront of people's minds. There has been some work in economics thinking a bit more about sex, but there's been a lot less thinking about ethnicity. So what you can see from this graph is that about 2% of publications, all the way back to the late 60s, about 2% of publications in economics are somehow touching on questions of race or ethnicity, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. There's a different choice typically of language about race or ethnicity. For me, I've used them interchangeably. But I know that if you're in some other fields, you might feel strongly about the different distinctions between them. Economists tend not to separate them, so when we look in the research, we kind of put them together. To get a sense for whether 2% is a lot or a little, I mean, one sort of thing to note is we haven't really changed how important we think this is for 50 odd years. So there hasn't been any kind of uptick in interest in this area overall. But to get a sense for whether 2% is the right number, it's hard to have a good benchmark for that. So we look at a couple of other fields that are also thinking out social science type questions. You can compare to politics; they do about twice as much work in this area. Sociologists were doing about 4 times as much work. They're now doing 6 times as much work in this area. And so that means that kind of cumulatively, if you look at kind of the sum total of contribution to human knowledge that economists have produced on this question, where we are in 2020 as economists is where political science was in the 90s, where sociology was in the 80s. So 30, 40 years behind in terms of the total amount of work we've produced in this area for these other fields. So the question of is that the right number? Maybe economists just don't think this is important, or maybe we think it's important, we just haven't realized. We really thought that was an important issue to decide: is this that economists have optimized and decided they want something different, or is this that we just didn't realize? So we went out and did a survey of a bunch of economists, and this is just the second picture I'll show you in this area, but we went out and did a survey. So the black bars here tell you the true share of research that sociologists do in this area, the true share for economists, the true share for political science. And then these colored boxes are showing you the distribution of responses by economists. So we asked economists, what share of research in economics do you think is race-related? What share of research in sociology do you think is race-related? What share in political science do you think is race-related? And so the line in the middle of those boxes is telling you the average, the median guess that people had. And then the spread just shows you how certain effectively, by looking across all the different responses we got, we can say 90% of people thought it was more than the bottom of this bar, 75% thought it was more than this, half of them thought it was more than this, and only 10% of people thought it was more than 16%. So what you can see is 2 things, I think. One is, we all kind of got the right idea. We all know, economists knew that sociologists really are kind of into thinking out this question, political scientists a bit less, and economists not really so much. So we all got this idea. The ranking between them is sort of what you would expect. But we actually are much more sort of over-optimistic about how much economists study this. We know our own profession least well. We all thought that quite a lot of economists were studying this, and we were quite a long way off the true value. At least with sociologists and political scientists, although we thought they studied it more, we were actually a bit more realistic about how much they study it. We were much closer. The ratio between the median and the truth is smaller, closer to the truth in terms of the median. The distributions overlap better, so there weren't as many people over-predicting as there were for economics, where more than 90% of people over-predicted how much we work on this. So economists don't work on this area very much, and we didn't know that. We weren't aware how little we were working on it. And so, that led to the question of, what are the incentives? Why is it that economists aren't studying these questions more? And so, some other work with Somkut Sen and Ross Warwick looks at who is producing this kind of research. And so that's really what I'll talk to you now about. And what we have in that information, we just have data on all academics and students in the UK. All UK universities, and we have information on ethnicity and some other characteristics over a kind of 6-year period. So we want to know who becomes an economist producing economics research, and I'll focus on that part of the question. We can talk a bit at the end about students and whether this is going to change, but I haven't kept all the slides on that in just for time. So the first thing is just what does academia in general look like? Because economics in academia is in an environment, in a background of academia more broadly. So what I've got here, and I apologize given I'm doing this for a Scottish audience, is orange dots that are showing the share of the working age population that meet these different ethnicity groups in the England and Wales census of 2011. That's because the Scottish census characterizes ethnicities differently. It's not consistent with the numbers that we'll then be able to have when we look at the academia data. So we weren't able to include the Scottish census directly because it doesn't map directly onto the same ethnicities as we have here. So I apologize that we don't have a direct map for Scotland, But these orange dots show you the shares of the population in England and Wales that were reported as being of mixed ethnicity, Indian ethnic background, Pakistani ethnic background, and so on. And if academia as a whole were representative of the population, then each of these bars would be exactly the same height as the orange dot. And if the gender split were kind of proportional to the population, then given the population is close to 50-50, you'd expect the bars to be equal parts, kind of reddy pink and greeny blue. And so the kind of two striking things you can see is that men are overrepresented. The green bits are bigger than the pinky red bits throughout. And secondly, that some ethnic groups are particularly underrepresented. So these are ones to keep in mind because it will show up basically throughout the next 5 minutes. But Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are always underrepresented, and individuals from various black backgrounds are also underrepresented. Chinese individuals are overrepresented in the population, in academia relative to their share in the population. So this is academia as a whole, nothing to do with economics. So it's that background where academia already, unrepresentative. Is economics kind of equally unrepresentative, or do we have further problems? So to look at that, what I'll do is to show you a chart where we're looking at among people who have become academics. So taking into account the fact that there have been all these problems getting different groups into academia, among people who've become academics, what's the share of them who become economists? So that black dashed line across the middle at 2% says that on average, 2% of all academics are economists. In that case, if economics was equally representative of academia, which is not representative of the population, then all of these bars should be pretty much dead on 2%. What you can see is, again, kind of a couple of things. The first is that, again, women are underrepresented relative to men. So the pink bars are always shorter than the greeny blue bars, with the exception of Chinese individuals. So that's the one group where where there are more women than men proportionally. And the other, and that, note that doesn't mean that there are more women overall, because women are generally underrepresented in academia, right? So women are generally underrepresented in academia. They're less badly underrepresented among Chinese women specifically. The second thing is actually, if you're looking at this, you would say, oh, on ethnicity, economists aren't doing too badly, right? There's quite a lot of these ethnicities that are pretty much at the bar, slightly above the bar, so it doesn't look too bad. But it's important to note that this is among all academics. If you were thinking about, if you're a British kid growing up, thinking out whether you had a chance of making it into academia, then you don't care kind of about the fact that economics is actually quite international and might bring in, say, Bangladeshi individuals from Bangladesh. What you care is if you're a Bangladeshi kid growing up in an immigrant household in the UK, what's your chance of making it through to academia? And there the numbers are a lot less good. So here what we're showing you is, instead of looking at all academics and looking at their ethnicity independently of whether they're from the UK or whether they're international, here what we're doing is looking specifically at whether they are British and are from those ethnicities. And here you see kind of the pattern that I showed you before, that the kind of the groups that are underrepresented, particularly are the Bangladeshi individuals. Pakistani individuals here don't look too bad in terms of their representation, and then women, particularly from various black backgrounds, are also underrepresented compared to what you would expect. So there are certainly some problems. The other thing to note is this is looking across all of academia, and in terms of who gets to produce fancy research, who gets to tell you about what society looks like, that's really not just everyone who becomes an academic. It's actually academics who go to these sort of research-intensive universities. So kind of the Russell groups in Scotland, that's Glasgow and Edinburgh, the two that are in there. Although clearly there are other very prestigious and very good universities in Scotland, Strathclyde being one of them. I should mention while Mari's here. But there are some using the Russell Group as kind of a proxy for thinking about research-intensive universities versus universities where the people are very good and they spend their time mostly teaching, which is really important. Teaching next generation is essential, but they don't then have the same capacity to focus on thinking about research and thinking about generating new information about what's going on in society. And so it's interesting to know, well, how do these patterns that I just showed you look at the Russell Group? So again, first we'll look at just all academics. We won't think about economics specifically. And these bars are showing you the share of all academics from different ethnic backgrounds who are in the Russell Group. And so what you can see is, a bit less than 50% of academics in the UK are in the Russell Group. It's slightly worse, particularly for Pakistani and Bangladeshi individuals and for individuals from various different black backgrounds. Here we've had to group these two categories. So Pakistani and Bangladeshis are now together. and the 3 different breakdowns we had for Black individuals have been combined together. And that's just because the numbers are now so small of these individuals at the top that it would break disclosure rules for me to tell you about them separated out. So in academia overall, you can see the Russell group is not doing as well for these categories of individuals, and economics is doing even worse. So actually, economists are slightly more concentrated in the Russell group because a lot of the more teaching-focused universities don't have economics courses. So actually, you'd expect, if anything, a slightly higher share in the Russell group for economics. But actually, what we see is a lower share for Pakistani and Bangladeshi individuals, and again for Black individuals. And so, again, when we're thinking about who gets to write about what society looks like, who gets to talk about what the research is, what the research questions that are important and produce things, it's not individuals from these backgrounds who are getting the chance to do this. So just to wrap up, I said I've got a whole load of material that I think is of interest, and I can send people links if anyone's interested on what's going on at the student level. So it's just a kind of high level point just to say, diversity is increasing at the undergraduate level in a broad sense, again, across all universities. If you were just looking at the ethnic minority shares, for pretty much all of the ethnic minorities, you'd see that diversity is increasing in that dimension. But that's still not really feeding through to the Russell group. So similar to this problem we have in terms of ethnic representation in the most research intensive universities, that's also true when we think about undergraduates. And that naturally leads through to the fact that undergraduates who go to those universities are the ones who are most likely to go on to further study, whether that's doing a master's and then going into government in civil service, or whether that's going on to academia. And so that's really important, that the fact we don't have this pattern of increasing diversity feeding through at the Russell group at all means that we're, and in that sense, in research intensive universities, means that we're not going to be seeing, it's not going to sort of lead naturally to a change in the future. And the final thing I'd like to say that I think is really important, and just sort of to highlight that, it almost looks like a blind spot in what I presented for today, is, obviously I focused today on ethnicity and sex as the 2 dimensions of diversity. At Discover Economics, which I co-founded and co-chair, we are thinking very heavily about diversity more broadly, and our kind of role is to try to increase diversity in economics across a wide sort of range of thoughts of diversity. In my own research, we're also thinking very actively about regional diversity, socioeconomic backgrounds, access to economics at school, which is kind of crucial in getting people to go into undergraduates. We've got lots of evidence of that now, to try and build a more comprehensive picture. So those questions are also important. I'm happy to chat about them, but we haven't yet got the clearance to show those results publicly, so I haven't been able to talk about that for today. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Lots of food for thought there. Mairi, we'll come on to you. Would you be able to start by giving us a bit of the Scottish picture of what's going on up here, and also tell us about the Economics Futures initiative that you work on?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the sort of aspects of the economics profession that Aaron's picked up on, ring true here, particularly when we talk about women being underrepresented, particularly in the senior positions in Scotland in the economics profession, and whether that's in sort of senior academia or other positions which are influential in the economics sphere in Scotland. I can say this as the first female director of the Fraser of Allander Institute, which is great, but it has been around for 45 years, and it's kind of amazing that that's the case. Some of these problems can obviously perpetuate themselves through things like a lack of role models for young women, for example, who are considering whether to pursue a career in economics. Some of the issues that Aaron mentioned around schooling is really important here as well. We don't tend to teach economics, particularly in state schools, both across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. There are other subjects that students can sort of look at if they're interested in sociology, politics. There's lots of choice there, but economics isn't taught as a discipline, which I think is an issue, except in some of the public schools in Scotland. So one of the initiatives I'm leading at the Fraser is the Economic Futures Initiative, and we're also working in partnership with Discover Economics, which is a great initiative. And really what we're trying to do is to encourage more people into careers in applied economics. So economics has a little bit of an image problem, I would say, in terms of what it's really about. A lot of people might think it's about finance, but it's not really, or it doesn't have to be, certainly. And trying to get young people interested in the fact that your economic or your analytical skills can be used to sort of deal with some of the big public policy issues we have in Scotland, whether it's in health or education or poverty. And this will lead to a greater diversity of people wanting to get involved in economics in the longer term. So that's one of the things we're trying to do through Economic Futures, is to educate both kids at school and undergraduates at university about the sorts of great things you can do with an analytical or economics degree that doesn't necessarily need to involve finance, unless that's what you're really interested in, and that's fine, of course. So that's definitely one of the issues that we have to deal with, to get a diversity of thought, both in the kind of socioeconomic background, but also when we think about gender or sex or ethnicity. There's also an issue about getting people in the profession in the first place, come to study through the schooling issues, but then also keeping people in the profession when they leave their undergraduate, and also encouraging people through to senior positions, both in academia and in wider public life. There's sort of that leaky pipeline all along, and we need to look at different areas for maybe addressing that in the future, whether that's about the routes we tend to have for people to get into senior positions in economics in Scotland through things like the graduate programme, or whatever. There's definitely an issue there about the diversity of thought that comes through that particular approach. So.
I'm muted. Thank you. You both mentioned schools. I'm quite interested in. Do you think we've got an opportunity from lockdown, because we've seen teachers almost move from being didactic in the classroom, giving away knowledge, to a bit more of a coach, and connecting young people with online resources, and particularly in schools where they maybe haven't got economic specialists. Do you think we might be able to almost connect more with specialist courses elsewhere by using online resources? Who wants to take that?
I think it's a really interesting idea. I mean, obviously, I think both initiatives like Discover Economics and Economic Futures can provide teachers with the tools to be able to more easily do that. But obviously, they have to be aware of those tools and aware of the opportunities themselves. And if they're not economists or specialists, they might not be aware of that. So yeah, I mean, that's an interesting kind of glass half full, like at what the young people have been through in the last year, and the sort of downsides of the kind of learning they've been able to engage in. But yeah, I think it's all about us creating the tools for it to be more easily accessed for teachers, so that they can think about introducing the students to this. But it isn't a set part of the curriculum to teach economics as a discipline, and I think Arun would agree that that's one of the issues.
Yeah, I think if I'm looking for my glass half full, I think it is probably that as we've moved to sort of different ways of learning and different approaches, there's some chance that even though it's hard to get a specialist economics teacher for a particular school, perhaps schools might partner up together and have like a specialist economics teacher across a few of them and be able to do the learning remotely or something like that. If I was trying to think of where's the upside, it might be something like that. But I think, critical is access is really missing in a lot of schools. It's particularly missing at schools for kids that are mostly attended by kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and that's really important. And sort of without access to it at school, we've identified very clearly that access at school is really the key driver to get students to continue on. If you've never heard of economics and the only thing you know about economics is some boring bloke coming on TV to talk about inflation numbers and how it's gone up from 2.6 to 2.7%. That sounds incredibly dull, incredibly dry. It doesn't at all represent what we actually spend our time thinking about or doing. But if that's what you think economics is about, no wonder you don't want to go and spend 3 years of your life or 4 years of your life studying it. You don't have the chance to see it, and without it being compulsory and without there being a better approach to getting more teachers into schools, it's hard to see that we'll get a change. I think one final actually point on that is it's also the case there's a lot of misinformation out there. The UCAS website we actually went there the other day, the headline is, you look for the economics course, the top of the page is money, and then it says economics is about the most important fact in the world, or the most force in the world, money. That's just not what economists spend their time studying. If you do an actual, and they'll have the representative surveys of what economists spend their time studying, we study people and how they respond, how they behave in response to various kinds of constraints under various conditions. And the different parts of that we all find interesting. Money is certainly in there. Money is something we think about, but we're not fundamentally studying money. And just like the fact that the UCAS website, when you're thinking about that transition into what degree do you want to do, and that's what it tells you it's about, that kind of thing is a real problem. So trying to correct those problems is really is a big constraint.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's great to hear a direct action there, because we've just spent the last 6 months looking at individual actions and what we can all do. So if anyone wants to email UCAS, there's definitely an action there that we can all take. I'll open it up then to questions now. We've got one from Chris Wright. Chris, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi there. I just was wondering if there were particular topics that you thought were affected by underrepresentation. I mean, obvious example might be unpaid labor in terms of underrepresentation of women, but are there other maybe less obvious examples where the knowledge is affected by that underrepresentation you're talking about? Thanks.
I mean, personally, I find it hard to know. I sort of, the thing I love about being an academic is I get to basically make my own description. I decide every day what it is I want to be working on, what I think is exciting and cool. And eventually I have to convince everyone else I think it's also important and exciting and cool. But I get to decide that first, and then I get to try and show everyone why I think this is a really important issue. And in a way, I can't know what other people who might show up in my position and could have a job like me might think is important. But I think it's, if you only have a set of people from a particular set of backgrounds, clearly the questions they're excited about and the things they might be most motivated to study will be different. And in a way, it's sort of, if we all knew what other people study, we could go and do it for them. I still think that wouldn't be the right approach, but you could kind of do that. I think the answer is we genuinely don't know how the profession would change if you were to bring in people from other backgrounds and say, well, what do you think is important with these tools that we have and with the way that we can access data sets and think about kind of learning about the answers to questions? What are the questions you think are important that we need to be answering? And so in a sense, that's why I think it's hard to find a different solution, a different replacement beyond trying to increase diversity in the profession, because anything else you do where you try to sort of get at what the question might be, you still might not really understand it. You still might also not get the right perspectives on, what are the other aspects to studying that and the other kind of issues that you just might not think of until, if you've never had any of those experiences. It's often people studying questions which they've had just zero experience in their life about, and so it's hard to know, when we study, say, for example, study benefits, if you're someone who's never been on benefits, parents were never on benefits, never had any experience of interacting with that system, it's hard to know, well, one of the real constraints might be that it's actually quite complicated to access these things, and they're really like long forms, and it goes back and forth, and even when you think you filled it in right, you still haven't quite done something correct. And you might just never think to look into that. So that's an example that I think people are fairly aware of, but there are other things like that. You just might not know what you need to know without sort of being at the sharp end somehow at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely agree with everything Arun said. You can see, for example, if you think about gender or sex, there's definitely a difference in the balance, for example, in different parts of the economics field in terms of the sort of balance there, which does suggest that if women were more represented in the economics profession, that the balance might be different. It does suggest that. And also the diversity in terms of socioeconomic background is really important as well, as Arun's touched on there. But there's also other aspects to it, of course. We're doing a really interesting project at the moment about the experiences of adults with learning disabilities. And, we've done a bunch of reports on that and, called them, Scotland's invisible people, because they just don't seem to get sort of regarded in social policy or public policy debates. And so there's all sorts of populations out there that if the profession was more diverse, there might be more research in these areas, and it would definitely change the balance. As Arun says, I don't know how that would happen, but what I know is the profession needs to be more diverse, so it's more reflective of society, so we're more likely to talk about these issues that are really important to people, and less about things that don't really matter.
Susan, I'm muted. Sorry, I keep making that mistake today. Ken, you've got a question for us. Do you want to ask that next?
Thanks, Susan. I think this probably overlaps quite a bit with Chris's question, but the immediate question that formed in my mind was if you're getting this very unbalanced ethnic mix in the profession, might that affect the outputs that we see coming out in academia? I know it's a difficult question to ask, and clearly economics is a study which seeks objectivity at all times. But do you have a sense from the work that you've seen that we may actually see some biases in the outputs from academia as a result of this rather unbalanced ethnic mix that we have?
Yeah, so I guess it's a really important point. So there's, step one is, what questions do we choose to study? But the other is sort of what conclusions do you come to? I think ultimately, certainly as an economist, I think we strive for, when you work as a sort of applied economist, you strive for getting results that are really based on the data and what the kind of world tell you, rather than something that's really based on your prior assumptions. It will always be the case that prior assumptions still matter, because even in just sort of thinking, oh, what do you think is a reasonable answer? I mean, clearly, if I try to look at the effect of some thing that I'm studying, and I get some answer that just seems like completely implausible, I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to really dig into the data. I mean, a good example actually is I have some work of my own. I work on these issues of diversity. I also work on other things, including top incomes. And we were looking at share of top earners that are migrants. I had no idea what number that would look like. I just thought, it was actually not the aim of my question. I was trying to study something else about migrants. And in doing that, I just thought, the first step is just, make sure I can estimate figure out how many migrants there are at different points of the income distribution. And we got this kind of extreme result that there are, huge, the number of migrants across the distribution is kind of flat, and then just jumps at the very top. And I just thought, oh, I've done something wrong with the data here. Let me go dig into that. And I questioned it. And after a lot of time, I figured out, no, it's really true. There's way more people at the top of the distribution who are migrants than, we always have the story that, migrants are down at the bottom of the distribution, maybe there's some in the middle, but it's really sort of low-skilled migration is almost sometimes the problem. But certainly low-skilled migration is where migrants are, and then some further up. But actually, the concentrations at the top are much larger than the concentrations down at the bottom. And it kind of amazed me. Now, I spent a lot of time digging into that because I didn't initially believe it, and then I eventually concluded that it really is true. But we sort of question the things that are inconsistent with our assumptions about the world. And if you have people who just have different approaches to things and come from different backgrounds, the things that they think are implausible or plausible, the point at which they stop questioning, they stop digging and trying to find out, well, what is going on here, what is happening, will be different, because they just think, oh, that's totally consistent. So you might have some assumption about what you think unemployed people are like, and so you kind of do some research, you get some answer, and you think, okay, that seems plausible to me. I'm not going to kind of dig further. I'm not going to try to understand it further because it seems right. Whereas if you maybe have had some experience with that, you'd say, well, that just doesn't feel right. That doesn't seem consistent with what I know. And it might still be right, but you'd at least dig it further and you'd really understand. You kind of get to the bottom of why is it there? What do we learn about it? You get a kind of richer approach to answering the question, I think. So I think we can certainly say that, even if I think it's harder to say whether or not things are actually incorrect. Yeah, at least you know more about them and you understand them better.
I think there's also an interesting thing for me, not just about making the profession more diverse, and obviously these things can be slow to change, but also about what we value as a profession, I suppose, in terms of research outputs and things like that. It appears to me, as somebody who works in applied economics, that sometimes the application of economic theory or techniques to real life problems seems to be valued less in academia or in academic outputs than more theoretical work, which I think is an interesting. It's very interesting that that's the case. Whereas I'm quite passionate about us using our skills to shed light on real life problems and helping have a real impact, perhaps on decision making, or shedding light where there should be more. More use of evidence, or where people maybe aren't using evidence appropriately, and that sort of thing. So I just think that's quite an interesting thing as an economics profession, that we need to keep asking ourselves if the balance is right between work which actually has an impact on real life problems versus more theoretical work. But Arun may disagree with that. That's just my personal view.
I agree entirely.
Okay, good.
One of the things we looked at in our last event was a book on the double X economy by Professor Linda Scott. And that book raises the issue of women economists struggling to get particular papers published, because a lot of the academic journals have editorial boards that are interested in certain type of economics, which might not be the kind of applied economics you're talking about there, Mary. And I just wonder, do we think that a kind of mass change in the diversity of people going to press and full stop will change that? Or are those kind of who gets published still going to be at the hands of a small few?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think until the balance changes a wee bit in terms of those who are deciding, you know, what adds to the stock of knowledge, you know, I think it will be a barrier for women to progress or people who tend to be more interested in applied economics and using economics to solve problems. And you do have more of a diversity in gender and those sorts of roles. Then I think that's a big issue. And I think that goes to the heart of some of the issues about diversity in economics, is that the applied analysis is more undervalued. So I think that does need to change. And, you know, I hope that we can keep having that conversation so that we can try and change it. And certainly as a senior leader in economics in Scotland, I won't stop going on about it. So I don't know what Arun thinks about it.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we have this kind of change. I wouldn't overstate the effects of some of those things, in the sense that some of the evidence suggests that, for example, women are as harsh to other women and as sort of make it as hard for them to progress as men do. So it's not particularly, I don't think the evidence points to the idea that certainly men are more of a barrier to women progressing than other women might be when they take on those kind of senior positions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to change that anyway. But I think that in terms of changing sort of what kinds of research is done, I think that's sort of why we need a lot, and to think about a broad range of sort of changes in background, sort of attracting in, for example, in sort of linking to the example Mary's had, if you're sort of not wanting, if you're wanting more applied research and not as much theoretical research, then attracting the top women who might have gone into maths and bringing them over into economics does diversify the profession, in the sense that we now have more women. But if they're going to produce the same kind of research as someone else would have produced, and they're going to be interested still in the theory side, that's not necessarily going to be helpful for this kind of broader question of, well, what are the issues that we need to be thinking about and should be spending our time on. So I think we kind of need both these things. Like, we need to increase diversity, but there's lots of dimensions in which we need to do that, and I wouldn't assume that just doing that will on its own be enough to kind of break down some of the other barriers that we do have in terms of producing different kinds of research.
Okay. So we've got a question in from Sharifa Clark, who can't unfortunately unmic the microphone, so I'll ask it for them. Increasing the level of diversity in economics is a long-term project, targeting students pre-university, etc. But how do we affect current economic diversity, drawing individuals from other professions, whilst we're waiting for the future pool of economists to come through?
I mean, personally, I think that there ends up not really being an option. I don't know what Mary's view on this is, but my view is that it's hard to bring someone into, make someone an economist at the age of 40 or 20 or whatever age you're doing. You're going to have to put them through a set of training, and whether you do that training for the 18-year-olds when they're going into university, or whether you do that for 40-year-olds who are doing something else, I sort of, at least at Discover, what we've done is put our eggs in the basket of, let's focus on the people making that transition from school into university, and trying to get more of them to get into economics, for them to understand that, one, economics is super interesting, touches on all the kinds of questions they actually are already excited about, and they just don't realize that economists have lots to say about climate change, have lots to say about inequality, have lots to say about sort of racial injustice, or whatever question you're interested in. Essentially, you will find an economist who spent time studying it, and if you think that's interesting, you could become an economist and study it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you do not need to have maths. You do not need to have economics as a background. You can come without those things. There is a university for you. There is a place to go. And I think that's really important. And you can get students in once they understand that we study the questions they are interested in, and they haven't already ruled themselves out effectively. If they're excited by it, they could do it. Then that's, I think, really what we need. I don't particularly see that there's a stronger benefit to try to get someone who's somewhere further up the profession in some other profession and try and bring them over. Not that they shouldn't come. If they want to come, I think the economics profession should be very open to them. But I think if you're going to be an economist, then you sort of need the training to be an economist. But that doesn't mean there are not lots of other things that are very valuable to be. But if you want to be an economist, you need the training to be an economist. And I'm sort of focused on delivering that to the people who are coming out of school, trying to get into university, and then, whether they go on to do work in academia, whether they want to go into the civil service, whether they want to be an economist in other parts of society, either in the third sector or in companies. There's lots of kinds of role for them. And I think that's really where I'd focus where I am focusing my efforts.
Yeah, I think in terms of large scale change overall, that's correct. Although I mean, I guess I am somebody who kind of came to economics later in life. I have a maths and statistical background, and came into economics through national accounts and public finances. And then moved into the macroeconomy. So I suppose my story is a little bit more unusual, and there is a route potentially for getting people with statistical backgrounds who are interested in how we measure the economy, more interested in how it also works, and how that can shed light on how people may react to certain situations and so on. But I think the numbers that we'll get through that maybe fewer, but absolutely the profession certainly should be open to economic statisticians or economic analysts who can shed a lot of light on things like how we measure the economy, and how empirical data can shed light on things as well as theory.
You're bucking the trend in more ways than one. I'm kind of wondering, the thing we've touched on schools and education and economics, but when we asked people recently about the economy, it was really interesting because lots of people would just say, oh, we know nothing, it's too complicated, and just think they didn't have anything to say. And then when you ask them about other aspects of their life, they all related to the economy and they could explain those really, really well, but they didn't see that in the terms of the economy. It was really a really interesting kind of language separation, things that they knew really, really well, but they just wouldn't answer if you asked them a down an economic question. Do you think that's a kind of barrier, more generally in society, to people thinking they know anything about economics?
I mean, so I certainly would agree with that. I think that there is generally a lack of kind of economic literacy because we don't teach it in any way whatsoever in schools. There is no requirement that you have to learn a day of economics your entire life. And so it is easy to think, well, I don't know what economics is. It's this weird thing that some small group of eggheads study somewhere, and I don't know what it's about or what the point of it is or how it affects my life, because it's mostly described in terms of relatively dry statistics, that it's hard to necessarily see what that means for you for your day to day. If you are unemployed and you hear that growth is actually not doing too badly and the stock market's going up, and you think, well, those things sound like they're somehow about economics. I mean, as an economist, I say the stock market is not what I think of as economics. But if you are someone in your daily life who thinks that is, somehow the stock market and growth are the numbers for the economy, and inflation maybe, and you think, well, I'm not getting a wage increase, I'm potentially unemployed, I can't see what these gains have been. It can be hard because the language of economic statistics is not aimed at, unfortunately, is not aimed at the public. It is not speaking to the sort of their daily lives and what they experience, and so it's hard for them to see that there is actually a connection between the economy and what they're experiencing day to day. So I think it's much easier to talk to people about their daily lives and the things that are important to them, and then help them realize that actually they're the questions that they're thinking about. When we had this discussion about universal credit and whether the £20 top up would survive, the debates around that, or around free school meals and whether it's better to give people stuff in cash or in kind, or that's economics. That's what we do all day. We argue about is it better to give people stuff in cash or in kind or not at all, or what are the effects of these different things. That is exactly what we think about. And people would have been down the pub, they weren't down the pub obviously, but were the equivalent of down the pub arguing about these things, and not realizing that what they are talking about is one of the kind of things that we think of as a fundamental question for us. So I think it's really just essential for us to kind of provide that message through events like this, through other events that we can do, to try to get to the public that what they care about and what they think already is economics. If the schools aren't going to have it put into their curriculum, and I appreciate school teachers are busy, so it's got to be from government telling them this is what the curriculum looks like. Teachers clearly have too many things to do to how to deal with what a request for something to be added without something else being subtracted. But if this kind of key stuff that shows up in in politics, that shows up at every election, shows up in people's daily lives, if we can't get that to people through schools, then I guess it's on people like us to try and do our best to help get across the message that economics is really about their lives.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's funny. We've written in the last I'm just thinking the last few weeks, the sorts of things we've written about the £20 uplift, and then, you know, how it might be sustained, continually about the fact that growth figures at the moment in no way relate to anything that's going on, like on the ground in terms of the labour market, and the fact the furlough scheme has kind of broken that link a little bit, and the unemployment that might be coming down the track. We've also written about free school meals, and obviously the change in the budget in Scotland, and what that might mean for poverty and other things. So I mean, these are the things that we deal with all the time. These are the things we're talking about, these big social policy issues that, as Arun says, people will debate and talk about how they actually impact their lives. This is economics, and this is the sort of thing people study in our field. But it's about getting that message across that that's the sort of thing you can work on if that's what you're interested in. But you can do it from the perspective of what the data is telling us, and what the theory tells us about how people might react to different incentives or whatever.
Fascinating. We've got a question come in from Stephen. Stephen Watson, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So just trying to intersect those two themes, the one of raising the profile of economics, but also how it links to diversity. So Making Maths Count was an initiative of the Scottish Government to try and basically raise the profile of mathematics and get a more positive reaction from the public at large, as well as youngsters in mathematics. So I just wondered if an initiative like Making Economics Count might be a good thing to try and bring into this, at least the Scottish landscape, given that experiment that's already running with Making Maths Count. And again, how that links to maybe diversifying the economics spectrum in Scotland.
Do you know how successful that's been, Stephen, in terms of
I wouldn't want to sort of comment on it. I haven't evaluated it, but it has been circulating for several years.
Mm-hmm.
We have a month-long activity. I'm a mathematician at the University of Glasgow, so I'm aware of various institutions and schools have engaged with this quite strongly. Perhaps the signature of its success will take several years to dig in to see, but I guess in spirit, it's an initiative which I endorse, because again, the knee-jerk reaction to mathematics might be, oh, I wasn't good at that at school, and that already kind of creates a climate of aversion. And so just coming back to Susan's point, that when economics issues are raised, you often hear responses which sort of indicate it's complex, I don't know, but then in fact, if you dig further, you come at it from another angle, you find there is actually competencies and understandings there. So it may be partly an issue that a public relations campaign and an education campaign might impact or affect. So anyway, I've put the link in there to the Making Maths Count initiative. It could be interesting to think about.
Yeah, just to say thanks for that. I hadn't come across it before. Obviously, I don't work particularly in Scotland, but sort of across the UK. But it's definitely good to see examples of what's going on, both sort of in particular nations as well as across the UK as a whole, to see what examples have been out there and what might work. Because I think it's an area where people are still very much learning and trying to, we're all finding our feet. So it's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if you look at Ireland, I think Ireland has basically rolled out such an initiative several years before. And in some sense, maybe the signature for success or measurements of its impact may be better evaluated there. So yes, it's not a unique initiative to the Scottish Government. They basically try to take best practice from other nations to see what they can perhaps adopt.
Thanks, Stephen. One of the things I'm sorry, Mary, you're going to go.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, we've obviously been chatting to like quite a lot of school kids in different schools, and at the moment I'm trying to convince all the math students that they can become economists, but but I mean, I think the point that you can go on to study something like maths at university and then have a very diverse range of professions in front of you, including being an economist. It's kind of my sell to the students, which given my career, it's clear that can happen, and you don't have to just have a sort of set number of opportunities if you study maths at university as well.
One of the things we were talking about beforehand is are we beginning to see change already? You know, in Scotland we've got Kate Forbes as the Cabinet Secretary of Finance. We've got Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We're beginning to see different kinds of faces in roles that were traditionally, you know, all the same. I think that's going to make a difference to the number of people who have their voices heard on the economy.
Both letting the other one go first.
Well, I mean, if I could, there was one other question I quickly had, which relates to sort of what defines what's important and how that affects how we view things. So the definition of GDP, which is in some sense a very large-scale macroeconomic measure, you know, perhaps there's a question there: are definitions of GDP having an impact on diversity, and would a reappraisal of what we value there be helpful?
I see Mary has strong feelings, so I'll let her go first.
Well, just on Susan's question first, I mean, you know, it is heartening to see things change, of course. Although I think it's there's lots of facets to diversity, and you know, but it's nice to see progress, and it's nice to see a young woman being Finance Secretary in Scotland, for example. And I think that is an important step forward. In terms of Stephen's question, I mean, it's a good point, and obviously the way that GDP is measured has changed over time, and the production boundary, as we call it, has been extended to include different things over time in order to kind of preserve national comparability and other things. There's a lot of debate in the economics community about whether the production boundary should be moved again to include things like unpaid care and other roles which are more often filled by women. That's more difficult, I think. That's quite difficult because obviously it's not a transaction that's happening, so then you have to talk about valuing it, which gets you into some tricky areas. And I also think there's a debate to be had about how much of you know, the measurement of GDP we want to be imputed and subject to more methodological revisions over time. I think it's an interesting debate. I'm not saying I'm one way or the other about it, but I definitely think that conversation should continue to be had about what's included in GDP and what isn't. But as always, we need to remember what GDP is and what it isn't. It is not a measure of societal well-being or success. It is the measurement of all activity in the economy as defined by the manuals, and doesn't include some activity that we do have in our economy. So as long as we remember what it is, it's still a useful measure. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about whether it should be changed or include other things. That was a bit of a mealy-mouthed answer to that. Aaron, I don't know if you have any views on that.
No, I mean, I think I basically agree with Murray. My view is that I wouldn't change the measure. I mean, there are lots of changes to change, things that one might do in changing the measure of GDP. But I think the key thing is two things. So the first is that, you know, in terms of what you want to use GDP for, is it particularly helpful in that context to add in all the unpaid labour? It raises exactly all the questions that Murray points out, that it's harder to do that way. And you have the question of, should someone who is highly educated and is doing care work be the value of that person's time be valued differently than someone else who's also just caring, but is also caring for their, say, elderly parent? How are we wanting to value those things to kind of construct some number for GDP? How we want to think about that kind of stuff? And ultimately, I think that in a way, this is so the second point is, I think this highlights for me one of the things I find hardest to understand in this area, which is, at the same time as so many people feel the need to just say, like, economics is complicated, I don't understand it, I want to disengage from it because it's just this kind of complicated thing happening at some other level to me. Economics has somehow taken over the public sphere so that people feel like things like GDP are telling them about how society is being run, where GDP is specifically a technical measure that's useful for particular purposes, but we should not be starting to use it as the way to look at the way the society is working. And so, in a sense, one might almost, if the economists wanted this, you might think of this as the triumph of the economists. We got what we wanted and we have everyone measuring things the way we want, except that this is not what we want. The economists, if you ask us, will all tell you GDP is not a measure of this stuff. Instead, some people who don't really understand how these kind of things are measured have taken that as like, oh, here's a simple number that goes up and down and there's sort of something you can put on the news once a month as a regular bulletin, that's nice. And so there's sort of regularly these stories about GDP or about inflation or about something else that don't really understand kind of what it's actually measuring, what it's actually telling us, what you can and can't use it for. So I think there's a real risk actually with the way that some of these numbers are being used. And I think in a way the risk with changing the measure to say, oh, well, let's try and incorporate those things, is people start feeling like it's supposed to be a measure of you know, how well-being in society is going, and we just need to sort of like tweak that slightly better, rather than getting the more important message, which is this is not a measure of societal well-being or how well we're doing at all. That is not what it's for. It is for use. There are lots of useful purposes for it. This is not it.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. Donald's just got in under the wire. Donald McRae, do you want to unmic and ask your question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. From my perspective, the emergence of behavioural economics is one of the more positive trends in the profession over the last number of years. And I just wonder, will this trend encourage greater diversity, not just among students, but on business and academic economists as well?
I mean, I think, so for those who aren't in the know, behavioral economics is just a sort of approach to economics that goes beyond the simplest idea of economists, that individuals in an economic model are trying to sort of maximize their happiness subject to a bunch of constraints. And it says, you know, maybe they have some cognitive constraints, maybe they have other practical constraints, maybe they also have habits and time preferences that aren't just, I'm adding up the happiness I get from year to year or something. I think those are all important moves in a sensible direction. I mean, I don't genuinely have a good sense. My sense for talking to school students is that they haven't got any idea that behavioral economics exists or that it's an important part. I don't think I sort of don't think that that's the level on which we currently inform our school students, so they can be engaged with the question of, oh, I'd be a bit more interested in economics if only if we're doing more behavioral. I think it's an important trend. I think it's useful, but I don't think that the constraint at the moment is students at school know what economics is and think it's all, let's say, broadly neoclassical and don't know about the behavioral things. I think it's more that students don't really know what economics is. I think, you know, whether people are excited by it and whether it's sort of realistic and important, behavioral trends do matter, but I think that's not really the constraint. Personally, I don't think that's the constraint to getting people into school. My experience with talking to school students is that's not the level of information that they're now sort of fighting a margin over, essentially.
Yeah, I think you know, some of these kind of examples can be quite helpful in making students passionate about what applied economics can do, potentially. So, I mean, I think it is a useful trend, and it's a useful way to think about what sort of economic theory and what sort of experimentation and quasi-experimental methods can tell us about what works and how that then can be used to inform policy making in the future. I mean, I think the role of economics in ensuring that policy is evidence-based and that it's evaluated and we do what works and what actually has the outcomes that we're looking to do. I mean, if some of that stuff sort of badged in as kind of behavioral economics, and you know, then that raises the profile of that, and I think that can only be a good thing, because but I agree with Arun to a certain extent that it's that's not really the problem in terms of getting through to sort of school students about what economics really is, and that it's not about money. But I think it's a useful example of how economics can really or economic analysis can really help improve the problems we have in society.
Right, we're rapidly approaching the 1 o'clock klaxon. So I'm just thinking to give you a challenge to both of you to finish off with. If there was one action you would both like, or each of you would like people in the audience to do today, or one game-changing thing you think would happen, because we've talked a lot about incremental change today, but is there any big thing that you think, I wish everyone would just do this?
Talk to everyone you know about what economics is really about, and help them understand that it's not about some airy, fairy, dried numbers that are somewhere in the clouds that don't affect their lives, but it's really about their lives. That's really important in helping the public in general engage in economics, which I think is important for all of society. And to the extent that some of those public are parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, etc., of children who are thinking about this, at least those children can be making an informed decision about whether economics is for them, because I think there are a lot more people for whom it would be really important if only they knew about it.
Yeah, I think Arun's just like, I can't top that, so I think I would get on board with that. To talk to everybody about what economics really is and how it can help solve the problems we have in Scotland or in the UK.
Well, that is definitely a challenge that I'm happy to take up and happy to help David Hume take take up. So sadly, our time together has come to an end. I just want to thank both of you hugely. It's been really lovely to spend lunchtime with you discussing this, and definitely something that we will take forward and do whatever we can to get more people to understand economics. To all the audience today, thank you for your time and your lively questions. This is our last webinar before Easter. We're going to have a bit of time for some egg rolling at Easter. So we'll put our feet up and have a rest, and then come back to you after the Easter break with some more exciting food for thought. So do return, and please support the David Hume Institute, because we really love bringing you these thought-provoking sessions. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye for now.